Hello and welcome. This video is a kind of a quicker video to supplement some of the other videos I've done on taking high poly meshes and converting them into virtual tabletop, Tailweaver, Tailspire ready miniatures for in Unity. So in this video, I'm going to cover masking. So in my main series, I did not cover masking because I was just doing the fast and loose. Here's how you do a quick texture paint job. But masking comes up because masking prevents overspray. So in this video, I'll go through how to do masking, what are the basic controls, and how to handle masking on 3 different types of models, one with seams, one with separate parts, and one without seams or separate parts. All right, let's dig in. First, I do want to take a moment to explain sort of why this happens, because you'll probably get frustrated at some point with the overspray and start Googling overspray and projection and all these sort of things. But what is happening is actually a little bit by design. So if I go here, I've made like just so I could kind of draw an example, and we have our Crotaloo. So I'll just draw us a little Crotaloo. And there's his feet. Really awkward. Um, and when you're thinking you're painting, you would think that it's like in sculpt mode, where your paintbrush is a sphere with your center, and if you were painting, say, here on the foot, it would be around this area based off what you can see with a limit to the space. But that's not how texture painting works in Blender. Texture painting works in Blender by assuming that the view that you are seeing your model through, so whatever your perspective is, and your brush is essentially painting on the surface of that. So if I take paint, say here, I'm not really painting on the model like this. I am painting on what it perceives as my view of the model, which means this paint will hit here and here. Or if you're up here, just if I use this example, it might paint things here and maybe here. So that's sort of what you have to consider. This is kind of a projection where it's actually viewing this as the two-dimensional space. Now, there may be advantages of doing it that way, which is why it's the way Blender has retained it in the workflows. But how do we get around it? And that's through masking. Okay, so there are different ways, I think I said, that masking works. So we're going to start with assuming that your model is one that does not have seams because you did a fast and loose method of getting your normals together. We're also going to assume that you have a single mesh. So when I'm looking at this model, I know that it is only one mesh because I made it. What I mean by multiple meshes might be that the saddle is a separate mesh from the object. Now, how would I know that that's the case? Well, ultimately, it doesn't matter. You'll find out when you try to do some of these methods. But what you could do is you could always go back into layout mode. And obviously this puts us back in this view unless we change it. And if we go from here into edit mode, I'll actually leave that there, it's easier to see, and grab our mesh, all of it, using the A on our keyboard, and go to mesh separate by loose parts. Now, nothing happened because this is a single mesh. If our mesh was composed of lots of single meshes, like the bedroll was a mesh, the saddle was a separate mesh, the barding was a separate mesh, then they would separate and you would have multiple meshes over here. You could undo this, but it would just be a hey, just to let you know. The other thing you'll notice is seams. So when I am in edit mode, if I had seams, I would see them. They would show up like, let's see, like that. So you would see a bright line across your model where a seam is marked. So this model has neither seams and it is a singular part. So how do we mask it? So when we go into our texture painting, we have a few things. This icon next to the texture paint is your paint mask. So you'll notice when I do this, the model turns white and I cannot paint on it. So if I try to paint on it, nothing happens because it's masked everything off. The idea is that if you're masking, you're picking what you don't want masked. So you look down here. So right now I'm in paint mode. If I have this open, I can then select my mask and my select box for my mask. So in this case, I'm going to choose my select circle. Now what this allows me to do is select faces. Now you'll notice even though I'm selecting just this spot, it might select a larger area because it's based off of the actual low poly faces. But if I were to take this and just select the arm manually, then I could have that selected out for painting. And then, and if I hit Control Select, it is unselecting things. And if I hit Shift Select, it adds things. So add, Control Subtract, Control Subtract, Shift Add, Control to Subtract, Shift Add, Shift Add, Shift Add, Control to Subtract, Control to Subtract. Okay, and Control to Subtract. Now it's a little bit messy, you'll notice, but now when I paint, if I go back to my paint tool, and I can do this, it holds my mask, and I paint. Now I'm painting just this area, and I'm not going to get overspray on other parts of my model. And that's handy. This also works with the fill tool. So if I were to take the fill tool and grab this, and oh, I'm on lighten from earlier, sorry. I can just fill in that area. So this may be helpful if you are masking off like the saddle and wanting to work on it separately from the rest of the model. You can simply mask it off. So if I were to go, I can unhide that for a minute. If I go back into masking, it still retains what I had, but just by selecting a different area, it's going to pick that area instead. And I could just mask off this and then paint it from there. So that's the basic principle. You can also, instead of choosing one or the other, I might say, well, I want to work on everything except what's in front. That's going to be a pain to kind of select everything. So what you can do is select the thing you don't want to work on. Let's say I don't want to work on this bedroll. I guess I might take a little more time with it. But assuming I have what I want, I can then go to Select and Invert. Now I have everything but that selected. And this is also where you find your shortcuts. So select all, select none, invert the selection, box select, circle select, lasso select, and there's some different versions of that. And then select linked, which we'll talk about a little bit here in a second. So that's how you isolate part of your mesh for painting. You basically can go into viewing the paint mask and then adding to the paint mask and going from there. Now, you may wonder, what about the selection that's just the mask? Well, that's if you're doing some of these other selections. Basically, this, let me get that back. This is sort of giving you those pick options within the mask. So if you're like, wait, why can't I select anything? Well, you might have the mask itself selected where you need to actually be selecting like this. So it's a little bit to get used to in terms of the interface, but that's the basics of masking on an object that has no preset seams or preset anything. All right, so let's say we have a model that has seams. Now I know this has seams because I put the seams on it, but also you'll notice in a model with seams, chances are your UV map will look something more like this, where you see isolated sections that relate to parts of the actual model. You'll also notice that if you go into edit mode, you can see lines on it. Now these lines indicate that that is where a seam is, and that's called seam painting, which I think I touched on in a separate video, but I'll probably add one to this series as well because it really does help when you're doing texture painting and UV unwrapping. But let's go back into texture paint mode and get off of my mask. But let's say we have seam painting and we do want a mask. So I lied, we're going to put right back on the face mask. And when I select a section, I might say I want to select some of like the bobbles. Maybe I want to do those things. Because these are seamed, they are considered linked spaces. So what I can instead do is hit Control L, and you'll notice that it selects all the faces within those seam bounds. So if I believe in some, it might be Shift, but this is the linked. So if you go to Select Linked, it's going to pick up anything that is linked based off of the seam. So if I want to grab this guy, I can hit select linked, and now it pulls that out. Now you can see how much easier this makes determining where I want to paint, because I don't have to go in and manually grab sections. Same thing for my stalk of my plant here. And by the by, this is not my plant. I'll put a link to it in the description of the video. This is from Grim Greeble, but I love their minis. But yes, so see how quickly I can mask that. And now that I've got that masked, I can simply go in and see, drop that down, put that as regular color. So if you're wondering why I couldn't print there for a second, Effect Alpha was unchecked. So, but now you can see I can quickly layer a coat there. I could do like a gradient coat, which I'll talk about maybe a bit more in a later video. But that was super painless. And now I can select the inverts. And now I have my dots selected. And I will maybe make those let's do a color. We can make a bright orangish yellow. You can paint them all as one. All right. So let's look at sort of this mech sort of model. And I know that this model is composed of a lot of different parts, because this question came up from Panoramic Panda, and we talked about it. And I was curious too, because he had said something about how masking worked for him, and I was like, I don't know that it should work that way. And then I looked into it and found out why. So this is a unique situation that you will likely get if you're working with sort of kit bashed models, or models that are made up of a lot of parts. This is common when you're doing like tanks and mechs and things like that. So if I were to go back into layout view and look at this guy and grab him, and let's go back into edit mode. Now, what is not easy to see from here until we start going inside the model and we notice that it's really, really cluttered, and you won't tell much, but I promise you it would make sense if you knew what you're looking at. Here we go. So if we're looking down the gun, we see that there's meshes intersecting meshes intersecting meshes. That indicates that these are all independent mesh parts simply layered onto each other. Now, for 3D printing, this can or cannot be problematic. These models have to be repaired when we prep them for print. It's not a right or a wrong, it's just sort of the way it works. You can also kind of tell that here. You can easily see that there's no true intersection line between these pieces. So we can also take this whole model, and if I were to go to mesh and say separate by loose parts, we end up with 138 loose parts. So this means that that's a mesh, 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 that's so on. Now, I'm going to undo this because we certainly want them all to be a single mesh. In terms of independent parts of a single mesh is fine. So we've got it reunionized. So it really just changes the way texture painting works. And I won't speak to whether or not it's a good idea to use some of these. You could have problems down the road from it. You might get weird things going on with your normals, but if it works, it works. So just roll with it. If you have weird problems from it, just know that it can happen. But regardless, we're back here on this model. And I have not made a normal map of it. I just ran with what we had. So if I were to do the same thing and do the mesh select in when we're masking, I can select a piece, and if I go to select linked or Control L, you'll notice it picked this whole section because that is a single mesh. Or if I go here and hit Control L, it picks that whole section. Yeah, I can shift select those in. Oop, grab too much. Shift select, shift select, shift select, Control L. Now I have these ready for painting. And now you may notice that that works for you, and it can be really, really easy when you're painting something like this, because it makes it very quick to mask and grab parts. Ooh, a little too much red there. So if I go this view and I want to grab, say, maybe just that. Sorry, click that. Control L, select linked, and let's go to my paint. And maybe that's going to be like a whiter that. and then take off the mask. So it makes it really quick and easy for painting in these scenarios. And I still have these guys in the front selected, so they got painted. But that is something else you may encounter when you're masking and painting. So when you're playing around, you can just go and turn your mask on and off. You can then adjust what is being masked when your mask is turned on by selecting faces. Shift select grabs additional faces. Control select removes faces. Selecting linked will only be beneficial if your model's made of separate parts or if you have done seam painting. And otherwise, those are the basics of getting your masks down. This will help you prevent overpainting, and this works when you're doing your fake PBR. It works when you're doing any of these things where you just want to have a little extra control over your painting. And I definitely agree that for models that are mechanical in nature, for tanks and things like that, it definitely is something you're going to do because overspray is a bit different there. Now, and so, yeah, hopefully this has been helpful and is just a good basic introduction to using masking when you're doing your texture painting.